All right, Shalom Israel. Well, Shabbat Shalom Israel. First and foremost, as always, I would like to give all praises, honor, glory, respect, and blessings to Yahweh Bahasham, Yahweh Shai Bahasham, Rakaha Kwadash. Salutations to the Lord's elect on the four corners of the earth, pushing His truth and sincerity while patiently waiting for Yahweh Shai's return. And double honors to our apostles and elders of Great Millstone, which have taught us everything we know through the spirit and power of Yahweh Bahasham, Yahweh Shai. And this is going to be a response video to a video that was done by the elder Manak Dizak from the Great Millstone Connecticut camp. I believe he's from the Great Millstone Connecticut camp, or Great Millstone New York camp. Okay, he's known as Elder Manak Dizak, and he did a response video which was based on an apology, which was by the Pope, by the way. It was an apology from the Pope to Uganda, basically for slavery. And when he did a response video to the article which he found, he titled his video, "There's no way you devils can apologize for slavery." And that was beautifully said. And the reason why that was beautifully said, because he's absolutely right. There's no amount of apologies that can surmount to the major and tragic trauma, atrocities, terrifying and horrifying and gory acts that have happened against the entire nation of Israel. Because what happened to us was more than just the Jim Crow era, okay? What happened, they did more than just the Jim Crow era to us. They did more than just the Devil's Punch Bowl to us. They did more than just Tulsa, Oklahoma, Black Wall Street. They did more than just Gator Bait, African Dodger, They did more than just put a bag over our heads and made us, have sex with our own mother, labeling us as motherfucker. They did more than just buck break us. They did more than just use our babies as gator bait. They did more than just, hung and lynch us in the early 1800s. Even in the late 1900s, okay, they was tying Negroes to the back of vehicles and pickup trucks and was dragging us to our deaths throughout the whole streets. We cannot forget about that. We can't forget about, how when before they would hang us, they would castrate us. They would chop off our hand. So we couldn't try to pull ourselves up from being hung, like how they did that one Jake, as the brother would show in this video. They chopped off his hand, they chopped off his foot, they chopped off his leg, and then they set him on fire after they riddled him with bullets. Okay? And then they set him on fire. And there are countless reports of them, of Edomites, which the biblical Edomites is the self-proclaimed white man. There are countless reports of him, of them gathering together in large gatherings and picking out what they would call a nigger back then, and all working together to beat him. I mean, especially when he did nothing to them, you know, they would beat him until he was damn near a vegetable, okay? And then they would drag him to a nearby tree and hang him. And sometimes they would hang us by the neck in groups. Okay, showing you that these devils knew the Holy Scriptures, because in the Holy Scriptures, as it is written, cursed be he that hangeth from a tree. So to some of us, they would hang by trees. And a matter of fact, there was a song that was released. I don't know the exact year, but the name of the song was called Strange Fruit. Okay? And basically, the song called Strange Fruit was all about our people. It was basically it was about strange fruit hanging from trees. And the strange fruit was basically people of Negroid descent who were basically hanging on trees in groups. Okay? So they did more than just all those atrocities. Remember when they used to tie ropes around Jake's ankles, and then they would have horses run in opposite directions until he was completely ripped in half? And it was basically a slow, painful death, because Jake was basically getting ripped in half slowly. And as he was getting ripped in half slowly, his entrails were coming out, his stomach was coming out, and basically he was screaming in agony until his spirit left his body. Okay? And they did way more than just that. Okay? That's not even the tip of the iceberg. Okay? You want to go to the tip of the iceberg, go all the way back to when the conquistadors, who was calling themselves the English Dutch mercenaries. Okay, well, the conquistadors and the English Dutch mercenaries, when they first came over here to the Americas, and they found out that that the northern kingdom of Israel, which would be the Latinos and Native Indians, you know, when they found out that they was living over here on this land first, you know, what did they do to them? Okay, first they gained their trust. According to the book of Psalms 55 verse 20, he put forth his hands against such as be at peace with him. He had broken his covenant. Okay, they came over here. They pretended like they was going to make peace with our people, right? You know, they came over here bowing down, crouching humbly, looking our people in the eyes, saying we come in peace. But what does it say in Psalms 55 verse 21? The words of his mouth were smoother than butter, but war was in his heart. His words were softer than oil, yet were they drawn swords. So when they came over here, okay, they completely did the North American Indians and the Latinos dirty. The North American Indians and the Latinos, which are Israelites, okay, they completely fucked them over. Okay, and the atrocities that was done against them was horrifying, man. Okay, do we have to talk about when they gave them blankets laced with smallpox? Okay, you gave the Northern Kingdom blankets that had smallpox on it. Okay, you called it a gift, a present. Okay, they were given smallpox. You gave them chickenpox, scarlatina, typhoid, typhus, And if you know anything about typhoid or typhoid and typhus is worse than bronchitis, because basically it leaves you with a whooping cough. If you don't know what a whooping cough is when basically you cough so hard that you end up being out of breath. So then you take a deep breath to catch your breath, only to cough so hard that you end up out of breath again. And basically you end up, the air ends up leaving the windpipe of your throat so hard from you coughing so hard trying to catch your breath that you end up suffering from internal bleeding inside your throat. So then what? Now you're not only coughing up mucus, you're coughing up mucus in blood. Okay? And this led to what? This led to the swelling of your throat. This led to your throat swelling up. Okay? And your throat would swell up so much that basically it will leave little air for you to breathe. So typhoid and typhus were diseases that ultimately led to suffocation. Okay? It led to suffocation. Okay? They gave our people lice, chicken pox, you see? They did all this to our people, man. Okay? They did all this to our people. You know? And that still isn't the tip of the iceberg. What about when they hung the so-called North American women by their necks? Now, and don't worry, I'm going to pull out some scriptures. I'm just pulling up I'm just pulling up a little bit of the dirt on these devils, on what they did to the nation of Israel, out of spite, hatred, envy, and jealousy, which ultimately goes back to Genesis, the 27th chapter, right? When our forefather Jacob supplanted their forefather Esau out of his birthright and out of his blessing. But okay, what about the North American Indians? Okay, when the conquistadors and the Spaniards came over here, they took the so-called North American Indian women, right? They hung them by the necks, and that's not all, man. That's not all. Okay, what did they do? They would cut open the open womb of the pregnant North American Indian women. They would take the baby out and they would stump the baby. And if they didn't stump the baby to deletion, they would take the baby and they would slam the baby into a stone wall or into a tree or into the ground until the spirit left the baby. Okay? What about when they made deep pits with spikes made out of trees? Yeah. Did you forget about that? Well, when you would take so-called Gadites, which are the North American Indians, okay, and you would take Latino babies and you would literally throw them into the pits and watch them get impaled to death by spikes. Okay, remember when you would take so-called North American Indian babies and children and you would grill them alive on grills, on an iron grill, or when you would put them inside of an iron coffin and watch them get cooked alive inside of an iron coffin. Remember when you would boil so-called Negroes alive inside of pots? Remember when you turned Nat Turner into grease and you called it Nat Turner grease? And like I mentioned earlier, man, the Devil's Punch Bowl, okay, which was basically a concentration camp full of Negroes, okay, which will be Judah, so-called Negroes, Benjamin, which would be the so-called West Indians or Jamaicans today, and Haitians, which are of the tribe of Levi. Remember, you called it the Devil's Punch Bowl, and I believe you had a little bit of North American Indians in there too, but it was like this big round canvas that was surrounded by mountains and waterfall, and basically you made a concentration camp down there in that area, and basically in that concentration camp all kind of heinous and inhumane acts happened against our people. Yeah, remember that? all kind of torture. Okay, torture was going on down there. You know, or people were starving to deletion. Okay, a lot of our women were getting raped down there. And then the babies were getting deleted. Okay, so we can't forget about the Devil's Punch Bowl. And there was thousands, tens of thousands of Israelites who died down there. Okay? And these weren't just Israelites who died down there. These were Israelites who helped you build your motherfucking kingdom. And you repaid them back with Devil's Punch Bowl. You repaid them back with the Devil's Punch Bowl. Okay? And we cannot forget about the delectable Negro. Okay? When you used to cut Jake open while he was still alive. Okay, you used to cut off arms and legs while he was still alive, and you used to eat his arms and used to cook his arms and legs, you know, put a little bit of sauce on it, and then you would eat it. And you would do this to Negro children or Negroid children. Okay, so we can't forget about the delectable Negro. Remember when you used to make couches? Remember when you used to use the hair of Negro women for as cushions to make couches and chairs? Okay, used to make false teeth using Negro, Latino, and Native Indian teeth. Remember that? And the list goes on and on and on. Remember when you used to hire so-called North American Indians to go and hunt down other so-called North American Indians and scalp them alive and then bring back their scalp? Remember that? Using so-called Negro babies as alligator bait, just so you can catch alligators in order to make leather shoes, leather jackets, leather pants, leather shirts, leather chairs, leather couches. And then in the early 1800s, right, when y'all were done hanging so-called Negroes and doing all these atrocities to them, y'all would make postcards out of them and send them as gifts to one another. Okay, you would send them as gifts. Okay, y'all were proud about it. Yeah. That's where picnic comes from. Which it wasn't called picnic. It was called picnic. Okay, nig, N-I-G, picnic. And then, you know, after the late 1900s, they changed the pronunciation to picnic. But originally it was called picnig, which means pickin', which was short for pick a nigga. And what was pick a nigga or picnic, the original picnics, all about? It was all about finding a nigger who, you know, he could have been walking with his woman, okay? He would be bothering nobody, okay? You would gather him up. Y'all all would gang up on him, you know. You would take his woman, you would RAPE her somewhere in a public bathroom, probably beat her, run trains on her. Meanwhile, her husband was getting dragged off to a local park somewhere where basically he was getting beaten damn near to a vegetable. If he wasn't getting castrated, you know, you'd probably chopped his family jewels off, chopped off his rod, you know, then you would probably, you know, chop off his fingers, gouge out his eyes, pull out some of his teeth, beat him, you know, probably piss on him. And then you would probably, you know, if y'all had alcohol, y'all would pour alcohol on him, like brandy or gin or vodka. You would pour it on him. No, y'all would piss on him, piss on his face while he was screaming in terror. going through agony, excruciating pain. And then what? Then you would hang him by his neck. You would hang him by his neck and watch him bleed. You would watch him bleed to death and suffocate to death. And while all this was going on, you would take out a blanket, you would lay it on the ground, and then y'all would have a barbecue. Y'all would make sandwiches. You know? Y'all would probably have music playing in the background. And then y'all would make postcards out of what y'all did. And that's where picnic comes from, or picnic. You see? And Negroes getting dragged to deletion while being tied to the back of a pickup truck was common during the early 1900s. Okay? Mike Brown. You know? Emmett Till. Okay, which he was wrongfully accused of whistling at a so-called white woman, which I forgot, but he had some kind of disorder where, you know, like if you have a gap in between your teeth and you try to talk, sometimes it sounds like you're whistling when you're talking. And basically, the white woman wrongfully accused him and lied on him about whistling at her. So what happened? A group of Edomites abduct him, and they basically beat him beyond recognition, okay, until his spirit left his body. Okay? And that was not even 100 years ago. Okay? And what about the North American Indians, okay? Remember when they would take their muskets, right? Because we can't forget about the musketeers, right? They were called musketeers because they used to tote these guns that had a pike strapped to the bottom of it. And what they would do was they would take their pikes and basically they would stab their pikes through North American Indian children, okay, just to test their strength, to see who could shove their pike through these adults and children the furthest. You see? Okay. What about when they had the so-called North American Indians and the Latino tribes running through the woods butt ass naked, and then these Edomites, self-proclaimed white people, they will get on horseback or they'll be running on foot, and they will literally play a hunting game where they will literally hunt down North American Indians and basically kill them, shoot them, stab them, you know, terrorize them, whatever, you know. And don't get me started on the origins of Thanksgiving. Okay? Don't get me started on the origins of Thanksgiving, because it was not because Thanksgiving really goes back to when you Edomites, who was calling yourselves conquistadors at the time, okay? Thanksgiving goes back to when you Edomites that was calling yourself conquistadors at the time, when after y'all were making an end to slaughtering so-called North American Indians, right? And then y'all would if y'all didn't chop off their heads and put them on pikes, right? Y'all would take a sharpened stake, right? And while the so-called North American Indian was alive, y'all would sodomize him with the sharpened pike, shove it right up his anus, right? Until the pike came out, until the sharpened part of the pike came out through the top of his head, and then you would erect it. And you would have it sit there, you know, as an indication of victory, right? And then afterwards, when y'all were done making an end to slaughtering the so-called North American Indians, right? Y'all would sit down, y'all would have a feast, you know, where basically the stuffing was supposed to be the brain matter, the cranberry sauce was supposed to be the blood, right? The turkey was supposed to represent the so-called North American Indian baby, because they used to cannibalize North American Indians too, right? So the turkey would be the so-called North American Indian baby. The stuffing was the brain matter. The cranberry sauce was the brain matter. I mean, the cranberry sauce was the blood. Okay, what else? What else? Okay. I forgot what the scalloped potatoes was supposed to represent, but I think it was the bone marrow. You know, but you know, I forget. Okay. But basically they will host a feast. Okay. They will drink rum, you know. They would drink gin. They would drink brown liquor, and basically they'd be playing music. They'll be celebrating. Well, basically you got impaled North American Indians. You know, I explained to you earlier how they would do it. Well, while he was alive, you know, they would have several of them erected. And, you know, sitting up if they didn't have their head sitting on a pike somewhere. And basically they'd be partying, playing music, dancing, you know, probably was popping a women that night. So celebrating their victory over the slaughter of the so-called North American Indians. And that's where you get your Thanksgiving from. And those are that's your dark history of Thanksgiving. You know? Yeah, remember when you would take the so-called North American Indians and you would hang them by their neck, right? But you'll have them standing on their tippy toes. And you didn't just have them standing on their tippy toes. You had them standing on their tippy toes over some burning charcoal. Yeah, remember that? Okay, remember that? Okay, do you remember that? Because you sure as hell did do it to our people. And then the so-called North American Indians, you killed a lot of them off with diseases and viruses. You know? And we can't forget about Pocahontas. We can't forget about Pocahontas. You know? Yeah, remember the story remember the real true story of Pocahontas? Okay? A little 12-year-old, 13-year-old so-called North American Indian girl. Right, where you murdered her father and her mother. Well, you raped her father before you ended her life, and then you would take this little girl named Pocahontas. She could have been like 12 or 13 years old, right? And basically, she was raped multiple times by multiple men. Okay, and basically, she was raped so many times that eventually her spirit left her body. Okay? And yeah, y'all were running trains on her. Y'all sodomized her. You know? And did all kind of heinous acts against her. And that's the true story of Pocahontas, okay? Pocahontas was no love story, okay? And while all these horrible things were happening to her, she was crying and mourning over the death of her parents. Y'all probably slapped her and beat her just to get her to shut up because she wouldn't stop crying over the death of her parents. So come on, man. You got some nerve to apologize for slavery, as if slavery was just y'all whipping us on the back and making us build up y'all society. Nah, man, slavery was far, far, far more than just that, man. Okay? It was far more than just that. You know? You know? Y'all brought over Gatling guns and y'all was shooting down the so-called North American Indians. You know? Just shooting them down. And a matter of fact, wasn't it Cristobal Colombo who basically came out and said that basically he was slaughtering so many so-called North American Indians that his hand was literally glued to the sword. He couldn't even let go of the sword, man. So I mean, so what kind of shit is that? Huh? I mean, what kind of shit is that? Like, you see what I mean? You know? You know? And then on top of that, while y'all had us in slavery, right? Y'all literally castrated us. Remember when you used to chop off our rods and shit? And you know, you would chop off our rods. What about the so-called Negroes who would fail to bring back, you know, diamonds and gemstones from working in the mines? Remember the children that y'all used to have working in the mines? Okay, y'all made a movie based on that. It was called, I believe the name of the movie is called Blood Diamond. But basically, y'all had little Negro children, teenage Negro children, working in the mines. And if they didn't come back with diamonds, or if they didn't come back with something shiny or sparkly, y'all would chop off their hand. So they had to live the rest of their lives of not having hands. You know? Okay? And don't get me started on the transatlantic slave trade. You know? The transatlantic slave trade. Yeah, remember that? When you would grape so-called Negro women on the slave ships, and then when she would give birth to the baby, you would throw the baby overboard. Okay? Okay? And they show you that in some of these movies. Not movies, but some of these cartoons where basically the owner, the sailor of the ship, the captain of the ship would basically have captives with their hands tied behind their back, and then basically they'll have them stand on the plank, right? And then they will force them to jump overboard. And guess what? If they didn't want to jump overboard, you would literally poke them in their back with the tip of your sword, or you would shank them in the back of their ass cheek and cause them to lose balance and fall overboard into the ocean. Where if they didn't drown to death, right, they got eaten alive by sharks. Okay, there were families of sharks that would follow behind the slave ships because you were throwing that many slaves overboard. And your excuse for that was what? Because because the slave ships were sinking because there were too many slaves on the ships. So all manner of atrocities happened to the slaves on them slave ships, man. Okay? The slaves were literally pissing and shitting all over each other because you had a stack like sardines on the ships. We had to deal with the horrible smell of shit and piss on the ships. Okay? The hygienes were so bad on the slave ships that diseases were spreading. Okay? You had Israelite women who were giving birth to babies on the slave ships. You had babies who were dying on the slave ships, man. I mean, like, you see what I'm saying? You know? And then aside from all that, right? When y'all had us in hardcore slavery, you did, okay? Did you forget about the fact that you had slaves working until they starved to death? Okay? Or let's just say they didn't starve to death, but they were so weak because they didn't have the energy to move. Okay? You will go out there to the field where the slaves were at, and you will whoop the slave because he was too weak and tired to work. You will whoop him. Okay? Probably hit him in his eyeball with the whip, probably hit him on his arm, you know? He would be on the ground apologizing, begging for mercy, and you would just keep whooping him over and over and over and over and over. And then when he tried to get up, you would hit him again and again and again and again. And some of them, you would just whip till their spirit left their body. And guess what? If they were too tired, if they was too weak to move, you know, you had them working for 4 days in a row, no food. Okay? Basically, they would pass out. You know? So you had them working until they starved to death. No water, no food. So you're talking about an apology for slavery? Man, fuck your apology. Okay? The question is, what did the Lord say? Okay? And we can't forget about Derby's Dose. Yeah, remember Derby's Dose? A so-called West Indian? Okay? When he was out in the fields working, okay? Because, I mean, imagine you going 2-3 days of working out in a hot blazing field, no food. Well, there was this slave named Derby, right? Because Derby's Dose come from a slave named Derby, who basically, he was starving, so he decided to eat a couple of sugar canes to replenish his strength. Okay, and he got caught by one of his slave masters who saw him eating a sugar cane. So as a punishment for eating of the sugar cane, they took Derby. Okay, they took him to a nearby shaft. Okay, they probably beat him, but after they took him to a nearby shaft, right, they strapped him down to some wooden bed, and then they had another slave shit in his mouth. Okay? And then afterwards, okay, after the slave was shit in his mouth, they would put like some weird cage or some kind of device on his head. That way he couldn't vomit up the shit that was in his mouth. Okay? And that's where you get Derby's dose from. Okay? Okay, the Negro woman was getting RAPED multiple times while we were in hardcore slavery. Remember when the Israelite man would have sex with his woman, and then you would take his woman that he had sex that was rightfully his, okay, and basically you will RAPED her. Yeah, we can't forget about those times when the Negro slave would be out in the slave fields working, right? And then he would have to deal with hearing his woman getting RAPED multiple times. And it got to a point to where when the window was when the window was open to his slave master's home, right? He would literally hear his woman screaming and begging the slave master to stop, right? And then eventually, as days passed by, as days passed by, he would no longer hear his woman screaming or begging the slave master to stop. Okay, instead, okay, there would come a time and day where he would literally hear his woman, his own woman, moaning from basically getting RAPED by the slave master. So it went from please master stop to basically he would hear moaning coming from his own woman getting RAPED by his slave master. And you don't think that hurt it mentally and emotionally? Meanwhile, he had to be out there in the slave fields picking cotton, potatoes, vegetables, okay, tobacco. You see? Remember when y'all used to sell us on auctioning blocks, butt ass naked? Or what about when we would have, little Israelite Negro boys, little Israelite Negro girls, right? They could have been about 4 or 5 years old. Remember when you used to take our children and you would put lipstick on them? And I'm talking about little Israelite boys who were like maybe 5, 6, or 7 years old. You would take lipstick, you would put it on their lips, and you would literally turn them into sex slaves. Okay? You would literally anally RAPED our little Israelite boys, turning them into sex slaves. Remember that? You remember that? And then when you was done with him, you would ship him off to a different state where basically he would never see his parents again. And he had to deal with it. The depression, being sad, never being able to see his parents again. And basically he was forced to be a sex slave until he got to a certain age, until basically he was cast to the side. Remember when y'all used to whip us with a scourge of 9 tails? Remember that? When y'all used to whip us with a scourge of 9 tails? Y'all used to break the sound barrier when y'all used to hit us with those whips, okay? And then y'all wouldn't give us any anesthetics. We had to sit there and deal with the pain of being hit with those whips like that, man. We had to sit there and deal with it. You see? You know, we'll literally be bleeding from the wounds that was on our backs. So I don't want to make this video too long. In my next video, I'm going to bring out some scriptures. With that, I'm going to say shalom. It's on to the next one.